Now we'd like to discuss just briefly one particular context of the reception of the book, and that is the post-Yugoslav context. My colleague Djurdja and I have done some research on this issue, and unlike these other contexts mentioned by Professor Bojađijev, the book has not been translated into Serbo-Croatian, Slovenian, Macedonian, so there hasn't been that much of a reception as in these other environments. And for a start, let's just say that we decided to entitle the paper "Reception Without Receptivity" in the post-Yugoslav context, to paraphrase the famous definition of racism, modern racism, as racism without races. It's not Balibar's definition, but it's a definition that Balibar heavily relies on in the study. And that reception without receptivity basically means that the book has had some kind of impact on the post-Yugoslav space, but it's a very, I would call it, preliminary kind of engagement with the book. It's very cursory generally, and there hasn't been any systematic study on the book in the region since 1991 in the English edition. There's only been one piece entirely dedicated, or even that piece combined. That's a book review written by Gordan Maslov, who is here today. It's a 2008 review of both Race, Nation and Class and Michael Hart's and Antonio Negri's Multitude. So apart from this, all other references to the book in the region since 1995, that's the year the first reference to the book appeared, by Renata Selecl, a Slovenian philosopher, all references have more or less engaged only with fragments of the book, with either the dimension of nation or the dimension of race. Not a single one engaged with the dimension of class to any significant degree. So it's a kind of a fragmented reception, which, and now I'd like to just put forward one hypothesis as to why the reception has been limited in scope and has been fragmented and has not, for the most part, has not demonstrated elements of what we would like to call productive appropriation or some kind of substantive engagement. Now, how should one explain a limited reception of a book whose thematic field could not be more relevant for the former Yugoslavia, as Professor Bojađijev already indicated? Why has the study, which offers a nuanced conceptual apparatus for analyzing the breakup of Yugoslavia and the role of nationalism in the Yugoslav disintegration, not attracted more attention by regional scholars of nationalism, regional scholars of Yugoslav disintegration? Now, we believe that to begin tackling this question, we should take into account two principal factors of the regional academic environment. And due to time constraints, we can only briefly sketch these two characteristics. Now, we would like to draw the attention primarily to what we call the two paradigms of regional reflection on the phenomena of nationalism and Yugoslav disintegration, which are tightly interconnected, of course. And the first paradigm could broadly be defined as the paradigm of normative universalism, as we call it. Now, for lack of better terms, it's a paradigm that is characterized by a predominantly culturalist analytical framework for analyzing the empirical reality of the region, and a proceduralist liberal normative orientation. So these two are conjoined in the paradigm of normative universalism. And the paradigm, when these two come together, these two dimensions, the normative and the explanatory, it usually is concretized through a series of binary oppositions that are used to structure the social reality of the region. And this binary division, among these, the most prominent would be the binary division of normative universalism and particularism, as exemplified by attributes such as, on the one hand, the universalist can be understood as modern, bourgeois, industrial, socialist in one variant, whereas the particularist then becomes concretized through attributes such as traditionalism, ethno-nationalism, failure to modernize, authoritarian modernization in socialism, so on and so forth. Now, Balibar's and Wallerstein's study, as you already found out, is a study that belongs to what we call unorthodox or non-dogmatic Marxism. And so they're Marxist but non-reductionist kind of optic of Balibar's and Wallerstein's approach to the phenomena of racism, nationalism, and sexism is in no small part devoted precisely to problematizing the notion of Western normative universalism. And understandably, as such, it does not resonate particularly well with what we have called the paradigm of normative universalism in the regional self-reflection, theoretical self-reflection. But then there is the second dominant frame of post-Yugoslav theoretical self-reflection, which in our view combines the analytic framework of economism in the explanatory domain with what we call normative substantivism. And the two dimensions usually are brought together in one or another form of neo-Marxist analysis. Now, this, what we call economistic paradigm, once again for lack of a better term, has re-emerged over the last decade and a half precisely through a criticism of the universalist, that is culturalist/proceduralist standpoints, in which these latter play the role of what one might say constitutive other for the economistic paradigm. Now, wherever the universalists, that is the culturalists, tended to see normative particularism, traditionalism, ethno-nationalism, and the lack of modernization as the defining traits of the ex-Yugoslav social reality, the economistic analysis seeks to uncover the structural conditions of the region's traumatic recent history, primarily the logic of the restoration and consolidation of peripheral capitalism, justified through the discourse of economic transition. Now, should one not reasonably expect that the representatives of the economistic paradigm would welcome a study such as Race, Nation, and Class, which investigates the manifold ways in which nationalism, racism, and sexism function as productive factors in contemporary capitalism? However, one must bear in mind that this post-Yugoslav economism, as we see it, exhibits a relative lack of nuance with respect to phenomena such as racism, nationalism, and sexism. It has a tendency, a quite strong tendency in our view, to reduce this phenomena to pretty much what's usually called a superstructure in the Marxist analysis. So to reduce it to their roles in the legitimation of capitalism, or rather, to make it more concrete, the masking of the real relations of power and antagonisms within social reality. And then you can see the discrepancy here. The neo-Marxist perspective of Balibar and Wallerstein, in contrast, considers these denominators such as race, nation, gender, class, in their dialectical interplay as co-constituents of what is a simultaneously symbolic and economic reproduction of the capitalist world system. And it does not reduce, Balibar and Wallerstein do not reduce the quest for normative universalism in modernity to its ideological function in capitalism. They paint a more complex and ambivalent picture of the emancipatory potentials on the one hand and the systemic instrumentalization on the other of what Jürgen Habermas has called the normative legacy of modernity. So, since this perspective, their economistic perspective, is not reductionist, it's a sophisticated economism, it reduces the study's capacity to play the role of what one might call an economistic corrective to the regionally prevalent culturalism. And if one takes into account the complete ignoring of, practically the complete ignoring of race, nation, class by local Marxists in the narrower sense of the term, this has resulted in the practical non-existence of the problematic of class in the limited reception of the book. And then there is one exception that we briefly addressed, that is the Serbian-Hungarian philosopher Alpar Lošonc, who does refer to Balibar and Wallerstein. Now, who are these authors who do refer to the study that we have identified in our research? And there are some 15 to 20 articles where the study appears, whether in one sentence or in one paragraph or an entire book review by Gordan Maslov. Now, when we focus on these regional authors, the question arises whether one can identify certain characteristics of their perspectives that would explain their shared receptivity for the book, and whether this would be enough to consider them representatives of a nascent third paradigm compared to universalism and economism. Now, a good starting point when addressing this question might be to look at which aspects of the study figure most prominently within the regional perspective. And now I would like to give the word to my colleague Djurdja, who will tell us more about these characteristics of the reception.
Thank you, Marjan. So we'll talk tentatively about this third paradigm that we named postmodern sensitivity. And despite differences in these articles, which I'm not going to talk about all of them, but just three that I thought were the most interesting because they brought up a lot of questions, is that they all seem to refer to a chapter in Balibar's book, Is There Neo-Racism? And to a certain extent, that chapter marks the reception with this article, but there is a sort of an irony, because on one hand, there is an obsession with identity, and then on the other hand, there is a complete absence of the question of race. So that would be one characteristic that these articles hold together, and the second one would be the so-called methodological sensitivity in the sense that these articles do tend to offer more nuances and concrete examples as to how what Balibar argues that is happening actually happened. So, for example, Asim Mujkic talks about ethno-nationalism in the modern history of Bosnia, arguing two things: that it wasn't only sociology or modern sciences or social sciences that were responsible for the construction of the ethno-nationalism, but it was also language, which for him is fundamental, literature, politics, and philosophy. And on one hand, what he traces is from the 18th century to the 20th century, how different political paradigms, whether it is liberalism, republicanism, if it ever existed actually here, combined and appropriated all of these fictions and notions in order to create a homogeneous nation. And on the other hand, he does show again something that Balibar is very well aware of, and that is the notion of balkanization that was constructed here during the 90s in order to construct Balkan as something other, completely unknown to Europe, something that Europe was unthinkable. Mujkic shows that actually this balkanization is European invention. And he argues that this permeable boundaries between notions and concepts are very stable and very difficult to separate. The other article that was very productive to thinking about the question of identity was Renata Salic's article from 1995 that talks about the ideology of the modern nation in the Yugoslav conflict. And she traces that the heart of the conflict was precisely a form of meta-racism that perceives cultural as fixed entities and desiring to maintain cultural distances. Now, the question of distance is actually something that is very important, and I think that Balibar flirts with it in the book, so hopefully we'll talk about it later. But Salic actually expands Balibar's argument, because what she supplements Balibar with is the question of war. And she says, how can war distort all human relationships until one national identification prevails, and what is the logic of war? So one of the most productive aspects of Salic's argument is that she suggests that the success of Milosevic ideology, and actually the success of all neoconservative populist ideology, rests on the distance between ideological meaning, so the return of values, self-made man, independent woman, and the level of a racist and sexual fantasy that, although unmentioned, functions as a way in which the addressee deciphers the symbolism of the ideological statement. So saying, and it goes without saying. And on one hand, what she says is that it is illusion to think that there can be politics without fantasy. And yet, on the other hand, she does propose that there are two ways in which intellectuals should address the problem. One is to keep open the distance between ideological meaning and its addressee. And the other is to try to built institutions where racist fantasies would have no real effect. Now, this sounds very utopian, but we might as well try it. And the third one is Dragan Kujundžić's piece from 2012 that it's called Race, Deconstruction, and Critical Theory. And video is actually available on YouTube, so you can actually watch it. It's an encounter between Jacques Derrida and Etienne Balibar, who talk about the relation between deconstruction and critical theory. And Kujundžić summarizes really well the critical reflection on the question of race when he says the following, I quote, "Does the racial classification becomes a symptom of the class struggle of the subjugated races, those that are not dominant to white race? This strategy, which on the one hand traces the origin of races to the language of the universal conversion in theology, and on the other to the Enlightenment and bourgeois capitalism, has allowed Balibar and Wallerstein to treat race not just as an essentialized product of racist imagination, but also as the result of the movement of Western philosophy in the age of capitalism and colonialism." So by way of the conclusion, let me summarize again the third paradigm. On one hand, postmodern sensibility, obsession with the question of identity, the absence of the question of race. And yet, I think that the implicit in all of these articles, if I may interpret or misinterpret, is the question, how does one actually destroy the racist complex? And is it possible even to destroy the racist complex on the one hand? And on the other hand, I think that Balibar here flirts with the erasure of boundaries, which could be dangerous in a sense that the world is without boundary is the world of one. So I think that these questions are something that still haunt us, and I think that the question of race is a question that will be addressed in future, I hope, and that we will discuss later during our session. Thank you.